welcome to another edition of CNA Interviews. Today we'll be talking to Dr. Anna Lee Fisher, a retired astronaut who joined NASA in 1978 when she was selected as a candidate astronaut. A spaceflight veteran, Dr. Fisher spent 192 hours living and working on the Space Shuttle orbiter. She made history when she became the first mother in space in 1984 as a member of NASA's Space Shuttle Discovery flight on mission STS-51A. Dr. Fisher, welcome to our CNA studio. It's great, an honor to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first trip to Cyprus, so
That's
looking
great.
forward to getting to spend a couple days here.
That's great. Dr. Fisher, what was it like getting selected for your mission?
Well, for me, it was a dream come true. I wanted to be an astronaut since I was 12 years old. My father was in the military, and we were stationed at a military base in Kentucky in the United States. And I listened to Alan Shepard, the first American man to go into space, and listened to him talking to mission control. And at that moment, I said, I want to do that someday. But of course, it didn't seem like a very realistic goal. All the pilots were male, and they were all test pilots. Women weren't even allowed to serve in the military back in those days, so it certainly didn't seem like a realistic goal, but that was when the first seed was planted. And so when it all worked out and it was announced in January of '78 that I was in the first group of astronauts selected for the shuttle, and also the first group of women ever selected, it was like everything I had dreamed about, and it was almost like a dream.
So at the time you were married, you were also pregnant when you were selected.
Not when I was selected.
When you were selected to...
When I was selected for my flight.
For your flight, yes.
I was pregnant then, yes.
So what was the reaction of people when they heard that a woman, a mother, will be going to space?
You know, there were some people who, were critical, but for the most part, I think people understood. I won't lie and say it was easy. It was definitely difficult to be a new mom and also be training for your first space flight. But that was my dream from the time I was 12 years old. And actually, when I interviewed to be an astronaut, I actually remember I said to them, I said, and oh, by the way, if it affects your decision, I want to have a family. So I told them that from before I was selected. So they knew I wanted to have a family. I didn't quite intend for it to both come together that close in time. But, if you want something badly enough, you just do whatever it takes to make it happen. But I was doing the two things I loved most in life, being a mom and being an astronaut, and it was definitely a hard year, but I was committed to being an astronaut, and I wanted to make sure that I did an excellent job so the women that came after me could also, have the opportunity to be both an astronaut and a mom. So I took that really seriously.
So can you describe your feelings when you were actually on the day that you were leaving? And you must have had mixed emotions.
Oh, definitely. I mean, in fact, the entire year before I flew, the whole time. In fact, we videoed so much that whole year that first year of Kristen's life, she eventually became a broadcast journalist, and we joked that it was because she was on camera so much as a baby with me, so that were anything to happen to me, she would have all this video that she could watch of us together. So, but it was definitely mixed feelings the morning of launch. We didn't have iPhones back then, so I remember I called the hotel. Kristen was only 14 months old, so she really couldn't talk. But I remember she said, "I love," which is what was her way of saying "I love you," and. But I think my husband told me the families are brought to a certain location to watch the launch. And so my husband said that when the engines ignited, Kristen went, "Oh no, Mama." So even as a 14-month-old, I think she had some appreciation that something unusual was happening. But yeah, it was definitely a morning of mixed emotions, the excitement of finally you know, achieving my dream of going into space, hoping everything was going to work out well, you know, worried not only about whether everything would go well, but also it was a very difficult mission, the first time NASA had ever done anything like that. So, but it was just the beginning of an adventure. And you know, once we got out on the pad and we were getting ready to launch, you push all those thoughts aside and you just focus on your mission. I guess with my medical training and everything, I learned to compartmentalize and to just kind of focus on whatever the immediate thing is I had to focus on, and then later on when I have time, think about the emotional aspects of things.
And once you were in space?
In space, we were so busy that you really didn't have a lot of time to think about things. It was more like when you got back to Earth and you sort of went, wow, that really happened. And yeah, of course, on orbit, there was a little bit of time, but really not. You were just, shuttle flights were very tightly programmed because, you know, every minute was costing lots of money, and they wanted to make every minute count. So you really didn't have a lot of free time on a shuttle mission.
But you did have some time at night.
Oh, yes.
Night to
what we always
reflect.
What we did every night after we said goodnight to mission control, and after we finished up everything, we took like 1 hour to just orbit the Earth and look out the window. So I would just get up. It's hard to describe because the shuttle actually, when it's in orbit, most of the time is flying inverted with one of the wings into the velocity vector. So it's not like an airplane flies at all once you're on orbit. But the reason we did that is because then the windows are facing down to Earth. And so we would, I would get up where the commander sits and put myself way up right next to the window and go around the Earth one time before I went to bed and went to sleep. And, you know, that was a time when I had time to reflect on how, you know, what I was doing, how beautiful this planet is, how you don't see any borders from space, and how very lucky we are to have this amazing planet, and how we really need to take good care of it.
Yeah, it's one of my questions a little bit later on. So, so which was the biggest challenge you faced in your career as far as space, NASA is concerned?
The biggest challenge, I think, the hardest thing I ever did physically, was my first job was to work in the area of spacesuits, and they were trying to get a spacesuit small enough to fit someone my size, because the requirements to apply to be an astronaut was from 5th percentile female to 95th percentile male, and that's a pretty big range. And so we worked really hard to take the shuttle design suit, which was already pretty far along, so we didn't have the option really of changing it, but to try to get it into a size that fit me. And we never were able to do that. We were never able to get a suit small enough that you could easily get into. So eventually they made the decision that you had to fit in the medium or the large in order to do a spacewalk. So, but physically, the work in the water tank and with the pressure suit was physically the most demanding. I think the biggest challenge is just how much you need to know as you're going into space. There's, you know, you need to know the vehicle and all the systems. You need to know what your particular task is. We deployed 2 satellites, so I was the lead on one of those, and then I was a robotic arm operator, and so there's just a lot that you need to know, and you know, your life and the life of your crewmates depend on you doing your job and doing it well, and not making mistakes. So I think that's kind of like the biggest pressure.
What were your actual duties?
I had my 2 main duties was I was the flight engineer, which means I trained with the commander and pilot. We trained as a 3-person team for ascent and entry. So I was the person that was supposed to make sure we stayed on the timeline, make sure we didn't forget any actions, if we had a malfunction, make sure we were working the correct procedure and that we didn't forget anything. So that was like hundreds of hours of training as a 3-person crew. I was also lead for deploying one of the satellites that we were deploying, and then I was the robotic arm operator for the 2 satellites that we retrieved to bring back. And it was the first time anyone had ever brought hardware back from space. And these satellites are not little tiny Sputnik-sized satellites. They're about the size of a small school bus. So no one had ever actually handled hardware that large in space previously. And nobody had ever brought hardware back from space other than the Apollo astronauts bringing back the moon rocks. But other than that, no one had ever certainly brought anything back this big. And so it was just so exciting of a mission to be a part of. And it kind of laid the groundwork for what we would do later, building the International Space Station, where was probably the most complicated thing any humankind has ever done.
Do you believe it's easy enough for women to enter male-dominated professions? And balancing family and home is easier or more challenging nowadays?
Well, I think back, you know, in the the 60s and 70s when I was, you know, getting my training and entering the workforce, it was definitely more difficult for women to do that. I think a lot of men felt that you would get trained and then you might decide to have a family and not follow through with your job. And I certainly felt that pressure when I had Kristen. That was why I took it so seriously. I wanted to be sure that the women that came behind me, that I performed my job well, even though I was a mother at the same time. And hopefully I did that, because a lot of women have come after us and have had families. I think it's always difficult when you're in a demanding career and you want to have a family. I don't think it's unique to being an astronaut. I mean, now we have women that are in the military, that are fighter pilots. They're deployed for a year at a time, training for the International Space Station. You train for about 2.5 to 3 years, and you're gone for half that time, and then you go into space for 6 months. So it's definitely difficult. But as I told my daughter, you know, if you're doing something you love and enjoy, I think it makes you a better mom. You know, not everybody wants to have a career outside the home and have a family. But if you do, and you're happy at what you're doing, then you're also, I think, a happier, better mom. If you're at home and you really don't want to be, then you know that's not a great situation to be in either, where you felt like you wanted to do things and you weren't allowed to because you were a woman, as I think probably happened to many women, you know, back before the 60s and so forth. So anyway, I think, but there's no one right answer. Each person has to find what works well for them. And I wound up taking a 7-year leave of absence when I had my second daughter, which I don't think anyone else in the astronaut office has ever done that. And to me, that was important. I wanted to be home when they were young, and then when they were both back in school, I went back. And I'd have to say that going back after being away for 7 years was probably the hardest thing I ever did. But I'm so glad I did. And you know, it probably took a year to get back into everything, because everything had changed from the time I left. But do I regret that now, looking back? No, not for a moment. I love my career, and I love having had the time at home with my daughters, and I think I was able to do both. Plus, coming back made it such that people wouldn't say, well, see, we trained you and put all that money into you and then you left. You know, I came back and I honored that commitment, but I also honored my commitment to my daughters when they were young. And so I think for me, I found the right balance, but another person might need a different balance. And so I think that's what's hard, is that there's no one right answer. This is how you have to do it. Each person has to figure out for themselves what works the best.
And you continued with more projects at NASA.
And the fact that I was gone for 7 years, then when I came back, we were just starting to work on the International Space Station. By that time, the shuttle was already a very strong program. It was in the middle phase. It was mature. The shuttle was flying frequently. The training was mature. When I first started as an astronaut, the shuttle hadn't even flown. The training was immature. The procedures were immature. But all the people, when I came back after my 7-year leave of absence, were people that were used to the shuttle being a very well-performing system. Training was good. So as we started working on the International Space Station, things were like it was back in the early days of the shuttle, but there was nobody around who were still there who remembered except me. And so I think I was able to talk to the chief of the office and say, you know, people are being unrealistic in their expectations at the beginning of a program, particularly a big program like the space station and the international aspects. It's not going to always be a real easy start, you know, just learning how to work with all of our international partners. You know, the U.S. thought they knew everything about going into space. The Russians certainly have a strong history, and learning to work together. It took a while to make all of that work to where now we're, I think, on the 61st or 62nd expedition. And, but to be a part of that at the very first steps and to be able to bring the experience I had from the early days of the shuttle program to the beginning of the space station, I think turned out to be something that I was really excited about, and I think beneficial to NASA as well.
So what do you think should be the next step in space research other than the exploration of Mars?
Well, that I don't think there should be. I mean, I think that is the next big thing that we're going to do. But I think we're going to do it by way of going to the moon. So I personally believe we should build a base on the moon, which President Trump has announced he wanted us to be back on the moon by 2024. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that. I know NASA can do that. It's just a matter of whether they get the funding and the support they need from Congress.